The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain James Mitchell walked briskly toward the administrative building. His polished boots clicked rhythmically against the concrete pathway, and his uniform bore the crisp lines that spoke of years of disciplined service. At 38 years old, Mitchell had earned every stripe and medal through dedication, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the principles that defined military service. The base was already bustling with activity despite the early hour. Young recruits jogged in formation across the parade ground, their synchronized footsteps creating a steady drumbeat that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The American flag snapped proudly in the morning breeze, its colors vibrant against the clear blue sky. This was Fort Henderson, one of the most prestigious military installations in the country, where tradition and honor were more than just words. They were a way of life. Captain Mitchell had been stationed at Fort Henderson for 3 years, and, in that time, he had built a reputation as a fair but firm leader. His men respected him not because of his rank, but because of his character. He led by example, never asking his soldiers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Whether it was enduring harsh training exercises in the desert heat or staying late to help a struggling recruit master a difficult procedure, Mitchell was always there for his team. As he approached the entrance to the administrative building, Mitchell noticed an unusual commotion near the main gate. A small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be a heated discussion. His instincts, honed by years of military service, told him to investigate. As he drew closer, he could make out the voices of several people engaged in what sounded like an argument. At the center of the disturbance stood a man in his late 50s, wearing the uniform of a colonel. The insignia on his shoulders glinted in the sunlight, marking him as someone of considerable rank and authority. This was Colonel Richard Hawthorne, a name that Mitchell recognized immediately. Hawthorne had recently been transferred to Fort Henderson from the Pentagon, bringing with him a reputation for being extremely strict about military protocol and discipline. Standing before Colonel Hawthorne was a young man who clearly wasn't military personnel. He was perhaps 25 years old, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, a simple t-shirt, and sneakers. His posture was respectful but not submissive, and there was something in his bearing that suggested he wasn't easily intimidated. This was David Chun, though Mitchell didn't know his name yet. David had come to the base that morning for what should have been a routine visit. His younger brother, Private Tommy Chun, had been stationed at Fort Henderson for 6 months, and David had driven 3 hours from the city to attend his brother's graduation from an advanced training program. It was meant to be a proud moment for their family, a celebration of Tommy's achievement and dedication to serving his country. The confrontation had begun innocently enough. David had approached the main gate and presented his visitor's pass to the security guard, explaining that he was there for the graduation ceremony. The guard had checked his identification and was in the process of clearing him for entry when Colonel Hawthorne happened to walk by. The colonel's sharp eyes had immediately fixed on David, taking in his casual attire and civilian appearance. Without warning, Hawthorne had stepped forward and inserted himself into the situation, dismissing the security guard with a curt wave of his hand. "You there," Hawthorne had said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "When you see a superior officer, you salute. That's basic military courtesy." David had looked up at the colonel with confusion. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not military personnel. I'm just here to visit my brother for his graduation." The colonel's face had darkened at what he perceived as insubordination. "I don't care what you are. You're on a military base, and you'll show proper respect for rank and authority. Now salute me properly." It was at this point that other personnel had begun to gather, drawn by the increasingly tense exchange. David had remained calm, but firm in his response. "With all due respect, sir, I understand the importance of military protocol, but, as a civilian, I don't believe I'm required to salute military officers." This response had only served to further anger Colonel Hawthorne. His face had turned red, and his voice had risen to a level that could be heard across much of the surrounding area. "Young man, you are on United States military property, and you will follow military protocol. I am ordering you to salute me this instant, or you will be removed from this base and banned from returning." Captain Mitchell had watched this exchange with growing concern. He understood the importance of military discipline and respect for authority, but he also recognized that the situation was escalating unnecessarily. More importantly, he could see that David Chun was not being disrespectful or defiant. He was simply standing up for what he believed to be his rights as a civilian. The crowd around them had grown larger, including several junior officers, enlisted personnel, and other visitors to the base. Some watched with obvious discomfort, sensing that something was wrong with the situation but uncertain about how to respond. Others seemed curious about how the confrontation would resolve itself. David's mind raced as he considered his options. He had no desire to cause trouble or create a scene, especially on such an important day for his brother. Tommy had worked incredibly hard to reach this point in his military career, and David didn't want to do anything that might reflect poorly on his sibling. At the same time, he felt strongly that he shouldn't be forced to perform military customs that didn't apply to him as a civilian. The tension in the air was palpable. Colonel Hawthorne stood with his arms crossed, his eyes boring into David with an intensity that suggested he was not accustomed to having his authority questioned. The other military personnel present seemed unsure about how to react, caught between their respect for the colonel's rank and their sense that something about the situation didn't feel right. David took a deep breath and tried once more to defuse the situation diplomatically. "Colonel, I truly mean no disrespect to you or to this institution. I have tremendous respect for the military and for the service that you and others provide to our country. My brother is graduating today, and I'm incredibly proud of his commitment to serving. I'm happy to show respect in other ways, but I don't feel comfortable performing a military salute when I'm not part of the military myself." His words were measured and respectful, but they only seemed to further inflame Colonel Hawthorne's anger. "You think you can come onto my base and lecture me about military protocol? I've been serving this country for over 30 years, son. I've earned the right to demand the respect that my rank deserves, regardless of whether you wear a uniform or not." The colonel stepped closer to David, using his physical presence to try to intimidate the younger man. "Now, for the last time, I'm ordering you to salute me properly, or you'll be escorted off this base in handcuffs." Captain Mitchell felt his jaw tighten as he listened to the exchange. He had seen enough confrontations during his military career to recognize when a situation was getting out of hand, and this was clearly one of those times. While he respected Colonel Hawthorne's rank and experience, he couldn't shake the feeling that the older officer was overstepping his authority and creating an unnecessary conflict. David stood his ground, though Mitchell could see the internal struggle playing out across his face. The young man was clearly torn between his desire to avoid conflict and his conviction that he shouldn't be forced to comply with military customs that didn't apply to him. It was a position that required considerable courage, especially when faced with the full authority and intimidation tactics of a high-ranking military officer. The security guard who had originally been processing David's entry looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. He kept glancing between the colonel and the civilian, clearly uncertain about what he should do. Protocol dictated that he should follow the orders of a superior officer, but his training also told him that civilians visiting the base had certain rights that should be respected. Other military personnel continued to gather around the scene, drawn by the commotion and the unusual nature of the confrontation. Among them were several NCOs who had worked with Captain Mitchell in the past and held him in high regard. They could see that he was observing the situation carefully, and some of them began to look to him for guidance about how they should respond. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky, and the temperature was beginning to rise along with the tension in the confrontation. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle played reveille, reminding everyone present of the military traditions and customs that governed life on the base. It was a sound that usually brought comfort and a sense of order, but in this moment, it only served to highlight the conflict between military authority and civilian rights that was playing out before them. David glanced around at the faces surrounding him, seeing a mixture of curiosity, concern, and uncertainty. He realized that his response to Colonel Hawthorne's demand would be witnessed and remembered by many people, and that it might have implications far beyond this single interaction. But he also knew that sometimes standing up for what you believe is right requires courage, even when, especially when, it's difficult or uncomfortable. The moment stretched on, heavy with tension and possibility. Colonel Hawthorne waited for David's compliance, his eyes narrow with anger and impatience. David stood quietly, gathering his thoughts and preparing for whatever consequences might follow from his decision. And Captain Mitchell watched it all, knowing that he was about to witness something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about authority, respect, and the true meaning of military service. What happened next would surprise everyone present, and set in motion a chain of events that would be talked about on military bases across the country for years to come. It would force people to examine their assumptions about power, privilege, and the difference between demanding respect and earning it. And it would prove that sometimes the most profound lessons about honor and integrity come from the most unexpected sources. The confrontation was far from over, and the real test of character for everyone involved was just beginning. In the coming moments, actions would speak louder than words, and true leadership would be demonstrated not through the exercise of authority, but through the courage to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. As the tension reached its peak, Captain Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. He stepped forward into the circle of observers, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone present. His years of leadership experience had taught him to recognize moments when intervention was not just appropriate, but necessary. This was clearly one of those moments. The crowd parted slightly to allow Mitchell to move closer to the center of the confrontation. His approach was calm and measured, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he was not merely another curious observer. Several of the enlisted personnel recognized him and straightened their posture, knowing that Captain Mitchell's reputation for fairness and good judgment was well established throughout the base. Colonel Hawthorne noticed Mitchell's approach, but didn't immediately acknowledge him, still focused on his standoff with David Chun. The civilian had maintained his respectful but firm stance, neither backing down from his position nor escalating the conflict through aggressive language or behavior. It was clear that he was waiting for the situation to resolve itself one way or another, but he wasn't going to compromise his principles under pressure. The atmosphere remained tense as various personnel continued to gather around the scene. Word of the confrontation was beginning to spread throughout the immediate area of the base, and more people were arriving to see what was happening. Among them were several other officers, some NCOs, and additional civilian visitors who had come for the graduation ceremony. Captain Mitchell positioned himself where he could observe both Colonel Hawthorne and David Chun clearly. His military training had taught him the importance of gathering all available information before making any decisions or taking any actions. He could see the anger and frustration in the colonel's demeanor, but he could also see that David was not being disrespectful or defiant in any way that would justify the escalating confrontation. The situation had reached a critical point where something had to give. The standoff couldn't continue indefinitely, and everyone present seemed to sense that the next few moments would determine how the entire incident would be resolved. The graduation ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than an hour, and families and friends of the graduating personnel were continuing to arrive at the base. Colonel Hawthorne's breathing had become more pronounced, and his face remained flushed with anger. It was clear that he viewed David's refusal to salute as a direct challenge to his authority and to the military chain of command that he had spent his entire career respecting and enforcing. For him, this wasn't just about a simple gesture of respect. It was about maintaining the discipline and order that he believed were essential to military effectiveness. David, meanwhile, continued to stand calmly but resolutely. His decision to maintain his position despite the intense pressure being applied by a high-ranking military officer demonstrated a level of personal courage that was beginning to impress some of the observers. It was becoming clear that this wasn't a case of simple defiance or disrespect, but rather a principled stand based on his understanding of his rights and responsibilities as a civilian. Captain Mitchell cleared his throat gently, causing both Colonel Hawthorne and David Chun to turn their attention toward him. The crowd of observers also shifted their focus, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Mitchell's reputation on the base meant that when he spoke, people listened, and his intervention in this situation was unexpected but not entirely surprising to those who knew him well. "Excuse me, Colonel Hawthorne," Mitchell said, his voice respectful but carrying an undertone of authority that came from years of command experience. "I couldn't help but notice the situation here, and I thought I might be able to offer some assistance in resolving this matter." Colonel Hawthorne turned to face Mitchell fully, his expression showing a mixture of surprise and annoyance at the interruption. He wasn't accustomed to having his interactions questioned or interfered with, especially by officers of lower rank. However, military protocol required him to at least acknowledge Mitchell's approach, even if he didn't appreciate it. "Captain Mitchell," Hawthorne replied curtly, "this is a disciplinary matter that I am handling personally. This civilian has shown disrespect for military authority and protocol, and I am correcting his behavior accordingly." Mitchell nodded respectfully, but his eyes remained steady as he looked at both men. "I understand, sir. However, I've been observing the situation, and I believe there may be some confusion about the applicable regulations and protocols in this case." David looked at Captain Mitchell with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He could sense that this officer was different from Colonel Hawthorne, but he wasn't sure whether Mitchell's intervention would help or complicate the situation further. The civilian remained silent, allowing the two military officers to address the matter between themselves. The crowd around them had grown even larger, and whispers were beginning to circulate among the observers. Some were discussing the unusual nature of the confrontation, while others were speculating about how it might be resolved. The presence of Captain Mitchell had clearly changed the dynamic of the situation, and many people were curious to see how his involvement would affect the outcome. Colonel Hawthorne's jaw tightened as he processed Mitchell's words. He could sense that the younger officer was challenging his handling of the situation, though Mitchell was being careful to maintain proper respect for rank and protocol. "Captain, I think I'm quite capable of determining what regulations apply in this case. I've been in the military longer than you've been alive." Mitchell maintained his calm demeanor despite the colonel's increasingly hostile tone. "Of course, sir. Your experience and knowledge are highly respected. However, I believe this situation involves some specific regulations regarding civilian visitors that might be relevant to consider." David watched the exchange with growing interest. It was becoming clear that Captain Mitchell was trying to intervene on his behalf, though the civilian wasn't entirely sure why. He had never met Mitchell before, and he couldn't understand what would motivate a military officer to potentially put himself at odds with a superior officer for the sake of a complete stranger. The truth was that Mitchell's intervention was motivated by several factors. First, his sense of fairness and justice told him that the situation had escalated beyond what was reasonable or appropriate. Second, his understanding of military regulations suggested that Colonel Hawthorne might be overstepping his authority in demanding that a civilian perform military customs. And third, his leadership experience had taught him that sometimes doing the right thing required taking risks, even when it might be personally uncomfortable or professionally costly. "What specific regulations are you referring to, Captain?" Colonel Hawthorne asked, his voice carrying a warning tone that suggested Mitchell should be very careful about his next words. Mitchell reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small handbook that contained key military regulations and protocols. He had made it a habit to carry this reference guide with him, knowing that questions about proper procedures often arose in his daily duties. "Sir, according to Army Regulations 625, which covers military customs and courtesies, the requirement for saluting applies specifically to military personnel. Civilians are not bound by these requirements, although they are expected to show appropriate respect for military personnel and property." The captain opened the handbook to the relevant section and held it at an angle where both Colonel Hawthorne and some of the nearby observers could see it. The regulation states that while civilians should be courteous and respectful when visiting military installations, they are not required to render military courtesies, such as saluting, unless they choose to do so voluntarily. Colonel Hawthorne's face grew even redder as he realized that Mitchell was directly contradicting his position in front of numerous witnesses. The public nature of the challenge made it particularly difficult for him to accept, as it suggested that he had been wrong about a fundamental military regulation. "Captain Mitchell, I find your interpretation of that regulation to be questionable at best." David felt a wave of relief wash over him as he heard Captain Mitchell's explanation. It confirmed what he had believed all along, that as a civilian, he was not required to salute military officers. However, he also realized that the situation was becoming increasingly complicated, with two military officers now in disagreement about the proper interpretation of regulations. Mitchell maintained his respectful tone despite Colonel Hawthorne's obvious displeasure. "Sir, I understand that there may be different interpretations of the regulation, but I believe the language is fairly clear on this point. Perhaps we could contact the base legal office for clarification?" This suggestion struck at the heart of Colonel Hawthorne's dilemma. If the matter were referred to the legal office, there was a strong possibility that Mitchell's interpretation would be confirmed, which would be embarrassing for the colonel and potentially damaging to his reputation. At the same time, continuing to insist on his position in the face of a specific regulation citation was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. The observers around them were following the conversation with intense interest. Many of the military personnel present were learning something new about regulations that they had never considered before. Some were beginning to realize that their own understanding of civilian obligations on military bases might have been incomplete or incorrect. David decided that this might be an appropriate moment for him to speak again. "Gentlemen, I appreciate Captain Mitchell's intervention and his clarification of the regulations. I want to emphasize again that I have tremendous respect for the military and for everyone who serves our country. If there's a way for me to show that respect that doesn't involve performing military customs that don't apply to me, I'm certainly willing to do so." His words demonstrated a continued commitment to finding a peaceful resolution to the conflict while maintaining his principled position. It was clear that he wasn't trying to be difficult or disrespectful, but rather to stand up for what he believed to be his rights while still honoring the service and sacrifice of military personnel. Captain Mitchell nodded approvingly at David's statement. "I think that's a very reasonable position, sir. The respect you've shown throughout this interaction, even under pressure, actually demonstrates the kind of appreciation for military service that we hope to see from all civilians." Colonel Hawthorne found himself in an increasingly difficult position. He could see that the situation was not developing in his favor, and that continuing to press his demand for a salute would likely result in further embarrassment. However, his pride and his belief in the importance of authority made it difficult for him to simply back down from the confrontation. The arrival of additional personnel added another layer of complexity to the situation. Among the newcomers was Sergeant Major Williams, one of the most senior enlisted personnel on the base. Williams had served for over 25 years and had a reputation for being extremely knowledgeable about military regulations and customs. His presence immediately drew attention from the other observers. Sergeant Major Williams approached the group and quickly assessed the situation. He could see the tension between Colonel Hawthorne and Captain Mitchell, and he could sense that some kind of dispute was taking place involving the civilian. His experience had taught him that such situations required careful handling to avoid escalation and potential embarrassment for all parties involved. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Williams said, addressing both officers with the respect due to their ranks. "I couldn't help but notice the discussion taking place here. Is there anything I can do to assist in resolving whatever issue has arisen?" Colonel Hawthorne seized on the opportunity to potentially gain support for his position from someone with extensive experience and knowledge of military customs. "Sergeant Major, we're dealing with a civilian who refuses to show proper respect for military authority by rendering a salute when encountering a superior officer." Williams looked at David Chin carefully, taking note of his civilian attire and respectful demeanor. Then, he turned his attention to Captain Mitchell, whom he knew and respected from previous interactions. The sergeant major's expression suggested that he was quickly processing the information and forming his own assessment of the situation. "Sir," Williams addressed Colonel Hawthorne, "has this gentleman been disrespectful or disruptive in any other way?" The question caught the colonel slightly off guard, as it implied that the refusal to salute might not, by itself, constitute grounds for the level of confrontation that had developed. "He has refused a direct order from a superior officer to render proper military courtesy." Williams nodded slowly, then turned to David. "Sir, may I ask what brings you to Fort Henderson today?" David was surprised to be addressed directly by the sergeant major, but he responded promptly and respectfully. "I'm here for my brother's graduation from advanced training. Private Tommy Chun is my younger brother, and I wanted to be here to support him on this important day." The sergeant major's expression softened slightly at this information. Family support for military personnel was something that was highly valued on the base, and the fact that David had traveled to attend his brother's graduation demonstrated the kind of commitment and pride that military families were known for. "That's wonderful, sir," Williams replied. "Private Chun is lucky to have such a supportive brother. Family support means a great deal to our personnel, especially during important milestones like graduation from advanced training." Colonel Hawthorne could see where the conversation was heading, and he didn't like the direction it was taking. The focus was shifting away from David's refusal to salute and toward his positive qualities as a supportive family member. This change in perspective threatened to undermine the colonel's position that David was being disrespectful or problematic. Captain Mitchell recognized the opportunity that Sergeant Major Williams had created to defuse the situation constructively. "Sergeant Major, we were just discussing the applicable regulations regarding civilian obligations for military courtesies. I was explaining that Army Regulation 625 specifies that civilians are not required to render military courtesies, such as saluting, although they are expected to be respectful and courteous." Williams nodded knowingly. That's correct, Captain. Civilians visiting our installations are welcomed as honored guests. And while we appreciate any gestures of respect they choose to make, they are not bound by military customs and courtesies in the same way that military personnel are. This confirmation from one of the most senior and respected enlisted personnel on the base was significant. Sergeant Major Williams' knowledge of regulations and customs was widely acknowledged, and his opinion carried considerable weight with both officers and enlisted personnel throughout Fort Henderson. The crowd of observers had continued to grow, and many of them were now listening intently to the discussion about regulations and customs. Some were taking mental notes about information they had never heard before, while others were beginning to understand that the situation was more complex than it had initially appeared. David felt increasingly vindicated as the conversation progressed. The interventions by both Captain Mitchell and Sergeant Major Williams had confirmed his understanding of his rights and obligations as a civilian visitor to the base. At the same time, he could see that Colonel Hawthorne was becoming increasingly isolated in his position. However, David was also aware that the situation was far from over. Colonel Hawthorne had not yet backed down from his demand, and the colonel's obvious displeasure suggested that he might continue to press the issue despite the regulatory clarifications that had been provided. The civilian wondered what would happen next, and whether the confrontation would continue to escalate or finally reach a resolution. The tension in the air remained palpable, even as the discussion had become more focused on regulations and facts rather than personal confrontation. Everyone present seemed to understand that they were witnessing something significant, though many were still uncertain about how it would ultimately be resolved. Captain Mitchell continued to monitor the situation carefully, ready to intervene further if necessary to prevent the confrontation from escalating beyond control. His decision to get involved had been driven by his sense of fairness and his knowledge of proper regulations, but he was also aware that his challenge to a superior officer could have professional consequences for him. Regardless of whether he was right about the regulations, the situation had reached a critical juncture where Colonel Hawthorne found himself increasingly isolated in his position, yet unable to gracefully retreat from the confrontation he had initiated. His military pride and decades of conditioning about the importance of authority made it extremely difficult for him to acknowledge that he might have been wrong about the regulations governing civilian behavior on military installations. As the crowd of observers continued to grow, word of the unusual confrontation began spreading throughout other areas of the base. Among those who heard about the situation was Major Sarah Rodriguez, the base's staff judge advocate and legal officer. Major Rodriguez had been working in her office when a concerned NCO knocked on her door to inform her about the escalating dispute at the main gate. Rodriguez immediately understood the potential implications of the situation. Legal disputes involving civilian rights on military property could quickly become complicated and potentially embarrassing for the installation if not handled properly. She grabbed her regulation handbook and headed toward the main gate, hoping to arrive before the situation spiraled completely out of control. Meanwhile, the confrontation continued to unfold with all parties maintaining their respective positions. Colonel Hawthorne stood rigidly, his face still flushed with anger and frustration. He was beginning to realize that his demand for David to salute was not being supported by the other military personnel present, but his pride prevented him from simply walking away from the confrontation. David Chun remained calm and respectful, though he could feel the stress of the prolonged confrontation beginning to weigh on him. He was acutely aware that his brother Tommy was somewhere on the base preparing for his graduation ceremony, completely unaware of the drama that was unfolding at the main gate. David desperately wanted to avoid doing anything that might reflect poorly on his brother or interfere with what should have been a proud moment for their entire family. Captain Mitchell continued to observe the situation carefully, ready to intervene further if necessary. His decision to challenge Colonel Hawthorne's interpretation of the regulations had been based on his knowledge of military law and his sense of fairness, but he was also aware that he was walking a fine line between doing what was right and potentially damaging his own career by opposing a senior officer. Sergeant Major Williams had positioned himself where he could observe all parties while remaining ready to provide additional input if requested. His confirmation of Captain Mitchell's regulatory interpretation had been significant, but he knew that the ultimate resolution of the situation would depend on Colonel Hawthorne's willingness to accept the regulatory guidance that had been provided. The arrival of Major Rodriguez added a new dimension to the gathering. As the base's legal officer, Her presence immediately signaled to everyone that the situation had attracted official attention from the command structure. She approached the group with the measured pace of someone who was accustomed to dealing with complex legal and regulatory issues. "Good morning, gentlemen," Rodriguez said as she joined the circle of participants. Her tone was professional and neutral, giving no indication of her assessment of the situation. "I understand there's been some discussion about military customs and civilian obligations. Perhaps I can provide some clarification." Colonel Hawthorne turned to face the newly arrived officer, and, for a moment, his expression showed a flicker of hope that legal support might arrive to vindicate his position. "Major Rodriguez, we're dealing with a civilian who refuses to show proper respect for military authority. I've ordered him to salute, and he has refused to comply." Rodriguez nodded professionally while quickly assessing the participants and the dynamics of the situation. Her trained legal mind immediately began processing the relevant regulations and potential implications of the confrontation. She could see the tension in Colonel Hawthorne's posture and the supportive positioning of Captain Mitchell and Sergeant Major Williams around the civilian. "I see," Rodriguez replied carefully. "And this civilian is here for what purpose?" David stepped forward slightly and answered respectfully. "Ma'am, I'm here for my brother's graduation ceremony. Private Tommy Chun is graduating from advanced training today, and I came to support him." Major Rodriguez made a mental note of this information, recognizing immediately that David was a family member of active duty personnel, which gave him a special status as a visitor to the base. Family members were considered honored guests, and their treatment reflected directly on the military's commitment to supporting its personnel and their loved ones. "Mr. Chun," Rodriguez addressed David directly, "have you been disrespectful or disruptive in any way during your visit to our installation?" The question was straightforward and professional, but it carried significant implications. By asking about David's general behavior rather than focusing specifically on his refusal to salute, Rodriguez was subtly shifting the conversation toward a broader assessment of whether he had actually done anything worthy of the confrontation that had developed. "No, ma'am," David replied firmly. "I've tried to be respectful throughout this interaction. I simply explained that I didn't believe I was required to salute as a civilian, and I've maintained that position while trying to be courteous to everyone involved." Several of the observers nodded slightly at this response, having witnessed David's consistently respectful demeanor throughout the prolonged confrontation. Even those who had arrived later could see that he was not being aggressive or disrespectful in his interactions with the military personnel. Major Rodriguez turned her attention to Captain Mitchell. "Captain, I understand you've provided some regulatory guidance regarding this matter?" Mitchell straightened slightly and responded professionally, "Yes, ma'am. I cited Army Regulation 600-25, which specifies that military customs and courtesies, including saluting, apply to military personnel, but are not required of civilians, although civilians are expected to be respectful and courteous." The legal officer nodded and opened her own regulation handbook to the relevant section. She reviewed the text silently for a moment, then looked up at the assembled group. "Captain Mitchell's interpretation is correct. Army Regulation 600-25 clearly states that civilians are not required to render military courtesies, such as saluting, although they are expected to show appropriate respect for military personnel and property." This official confirmation from the base's legal officer represented a definitive resolution of the regulatory question that had been at the heart of the confrontation. There could be no further dispute about what the regulations actually required, and Colonel Hawthorne's position had been conclusively demonstrated to be incorrect. The impact of Major Rodriguez's statement rippled through the crowd of observers. Many of the military personnel present were learning something new about regulations they had never fully understood, while others were beginning to realize the implications of what they had just witnessed. A senior officer had been publicly corrected about a fundamental military regulation, and his demand for civilian compliance with military customs had been shown to be inappropriate. Colonel Hawthorne's reaction was a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and frustration. He had been publicly contradicted by multiple subordinate officers and the base legal officer, and his interpretation of military regulations had been demonstrated to be incorrect in front of numerous witnesses. The situation had become a significant professional embarrassment that would undoubtedly be discussed throughout the base for some time to come. However, rather than accepting the regulatory clarification gracefully, Colonel Hawthorne chose to escalate the situation further. His pride and His inability to admit error drove him to make a decision that would transform the confrontation from an embarrassing mistake into a much more serious problem. "I don't care what the regulation says," Hawthorne declared loudly, his voice carrying across the area and drawing even more attention from passersby. "I am a colonel in the United States Army, and I will not be disrespected by some civilian who thinks he can lecture me about military protocol. You will salute me right now, or I will have you arrested for trespassing and banned from this base permanently." The declaration stunned everyone present, including Major Rodriguez, who recognized immediately that Colonel Hawthorne had just crossed a line from regulatory confusion into potential abuse of authority. By explicitly stating that he didn't care what the regulations said, the colonel had made it clear that he was willing to use his position to force compliance with his personal demands, regardless of whether those demands were legally justified. David felt his heart rate increase as he processed the threat. The possibility of being arrested and banned from the base would mean missing his brother's graduation ceremony and potentially creating long-term problems for Tommy's military career. The stakes of the confrontation had suddenly increased dramatically. Captain Mitchell's jaw tightened as he heard Colonel Hawthorne's threat. The senior officer had just announced his intention to ignore established military regulations and use his authority inappropriately to force compliance with an unjustified demand. This went far beyond a simple misunderstanding of regulations and entered the territory of abuse of authority and potential violation of civilian rights. Major Rodriguez realized that the situation had escalated beyond a simple regulatory dispute and was now approaching the level of a potential criminal matter. If Colonel Hawthorne followed through on his threat to have David arrested for refusing to comply with an unjustified demand, it could constitute false imprisonment, abuse of authority, and violation of civilian rights. Sergeant Major Williams exchanged glances with Captain Mitchell, both recognizing that they were witnessing something that went far beyond normal military discipline or regulatory enforcement. The situation had become a test of whether the military's commitment to following its own regulations and respecting civilian rights would be upheld, or whether personal authority and pride would be allowed to override established law and policy. The crowd of observers had grown silent as they processed the implications of what they had just heard. Many were shocked that a senior officer would explicitly state his intention to ignore military regulations, while others were concerned about what would happen to the civilian who had found himself at the center of this unexpected confrontation. David took a deep breath and looked around at the faces surrounding him. He could see support and sympathy in the expressions of Captain Mitchell, Sergeant Major Williams, and Major Rodriguez. But he also knew that Colonel Hawthorne held significant authority and could potentially follow through on his threats regardless of whether they were legally justified. The moment had arrived when David would have to make a crucial decision. He could comply with Colonel Hawthorne's demand and perform a salute that he believed was not required of him, thereby ending the confrontation, but potentially compromising his principles and setting a precedent that military officers could compel civilian compliance with unjustified demands. Alternatively, he could maintain his position and face the consequences of Colonel Hawthorne's threatened actions. As David considered his options, he thought about his brother Tommy and the values that had motivated the young man to join the military in the first place. Tommy had often spoken about his belief in justice, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. The irony was not lost on David that he was now facing a test of those same values on the day of his brother's graduation. The silence stretched on as everyone waited to see how the confrontation would be resolved. Colonel Hawthorne stood with his arms crossed, waiting for David's compliance or preparing to follow through on his threats. The other military personnel present were grappling with their own decisions about how to respond to a situation that was clearly spiraling beyond the bounds of appropriate military conduct. What happened next would determine not only the immediate outcome of this confrontation, but also whether the military's stated commitment to following its own regulations and respecting civilian rights would be upheld when tested by personal authority and pride. The eyes of everyone present were on David Chun, waiting to see whether he would stand by his principles or succumb to the pressure being applied by a powerful military officer who had made it clear that he was willing to ignore established regulations to get his way. The tension that had been building throughout the confrontation reached its absolute peak as everyone present waited for David Chin's response to Colonel Hawthorne's ultimatum. The silence that followed the colonel's threat seemed to stretch on forever, though in reality it lasted only a few seconds. During those moments, David's mind raced through the possible consequences of his decision while the assembled crowd held its collective breath. Major Rodriguez recognized that the situation had reached a point where she needed to take decisive action as the base's legal officer. She had witnessed a senior officer explicitly state his intention to ignore established military regulations and threaten a civilian with arrest for exercising his legal rights. This was no longer a matter of regulatory interpretation. It had become a potential legal crisis that could have serious consequences for all involved. "Colonel Hawthorne," Rodriguez said firmly, stepping forward to position herself between the senior officer and David Shun, "I need to speak with you privately for a moment." The legal officer's intervention created a brief pause in the confrontation, giving everyone a moment to reassess the situation. Her professional demeanor and authoritative tone made it clear that she was not making a request, but rather providing an opportunity for the colonel to reconsider his position before taking actions that could have serious legal and professional consequences. Colonel Hawthorne's face showed a mixture of surprise and annoyance at the interruption. He had been focused entirely on compelling David's compliance with his demand and was not prepared for another military officer to insert herself into the situation. However, Major Rodriguez's role as the base legal officer gave her the authority and responsibility to intervene when potential legal issues arose. "Major, this is not a legal matter," Hawthorne replied tersely. "This is a matter of military discipline and respect for authority. I don't need legal advice to handle a disrespectful civilian." Rodriguez maintained her professional composure despite the colonel's dismissive response. "Sir, with respect, when military personnel threaten to arrest civilians for exercising their legal rights, it becomes a legal matter. I strongly recommend that we discuss this privately before proceeding further." The exchange between the two officers was being closely watched by everyone present, including Captain Mitchell and Sergeant Major Williams, who both recognized the significance of the legal officer's intervention. Rodriguez was essentially warning Colonel Hawthorne that his threatened actions could constitute criminal behavior and professional misconduct. David watched the interaction between the officers with a mixture of relief and concern. He was grateful that Major Rodriguez was trying to prevent the situation from escalating further, but he was also aware that her intervention might only serve to anger Colonel Hawthorne more and potentially make the consequences for David even worse. Captain Mitchell decided that this might be an appropriate moment for him to provide additional support for the legal officer's position. He stepped forward slightly and addressed Colonel Hawthorne directly. "Sir, I believe Major Rodriguez is offering valuable guidance that could help prevent this situation from becoming more complicated than it needs to be." The captain's words were carefully chosen to be respectful while still supporting the legal officer's attempt to de-escalate the confrontation. Mitchell was walking a fine line between supporting what he knew to be right and maintaining proper military protocol in dealing with a senior officer. Sergeant Major Williams also recognized the importance of the moment and decided to add his voice to the growing chorus of military personnel who were concerned about the direction the confrontation was taking. "Colonel, if I may, perhaps we could step back and reconsider how to handle this situation in a way that reflects well on the entire installation." The combined intervention of Major Rodriguez, Captain Mitchell, and Sergeant Major Williams created a powerful coalition of military professionals who were all expressing concern about Colonel Hawthorne's approach to the situation. Their united position made it increasingly difficult for the colonel to maintain that his actions were appropriate or justified. However, rather than accepting the guidance being offered by his fellow officers, Colonel Hawthorne chose to interpret their interventions as a challenge to his authority and an attempt to undermine his position. His response revealed the extent to which pride and ego had taken precedence over military professionalism and legal compliance. "I don't need advice from any of you," Hawthorne declared angrily, his voice rising to a level that could be heard throughout the surrounding area. "I am the senior officer here, and my decisions are final. This civilian will salute me immediately, or he will face the consequences." The colonel's outburst stunned everyone present, including the growing crowd of observers who were witnessing what appeared to be a complete breakdown of military professionalism by a senior officer. Many of the military personnel present had never seen a colonel behave in such an inappropriate manner, and they were uncertain about how to respond to the unprecedented situation. Major Rodriguez realized that her attempts at diplomatic intervention had failed, and that she now needed to take more direct action to prevent potential criminal behavior by a senior officer. She reached for her cell phone and began dialing a number, making it clear that she was calling for additional assistance. "Colonel, I'm calling the Provost Marshal," Rodriguez announced, referring to the base's senior law enforcement officer. "This situation requires immediate intervention before it escalates further." The mention of the Provost Marshal sent a shock wave through the assembled crowd. Everyone present understood that involving the base's senior law enforcement officer meant that the situation had escalated to the level of a potential criminal matter. Colonel Hawthorne's behavior was now being treated as a possible abuse of authority that required official investigation. Colonel Hawthorne's reaction to Major Rodriguez's phone call was one of barely controlled rage. He realized that the legal officer was essentially treating him as a potential criminal suspect, which was a devastating blow to his pride and his perception of his own authority and status. "You're making a serious mistake, Major," Hawthorne warned, his voice shaking with anger. "You have no authority to question my decisions or interfere with my handling of disciplinary matters." Rodriguez continued her phone call while maintaining eye contact with the colonel, making it clear that she was not intimidated by his threats. "Sir, my oath as a military officer requires me to uphold the law and protect the rights of all individuals on this installation, including civilians. I cannot stand by and watch while those rights are violated." The legal officer's statement resonated powerfully with many of the observers, who recognized that she was demonstrating the kind of moral courage and commitment to principle that the military claimed to value. Her willingness to challenge a senior officer in defense of what was right provided a stark contrast to Colonel Hawthorne's abuse of authority. David Chun watched these developments with a growing sense that the situation had moved far beyond his personal confrontation with Colonel Hawthorne. The incident had become a test of the military's institutional integrity and its commitment to following its own rules and regulations. He felt both grateful for the support he was receiving from several military officers and concerned about the potential consequences for those who were standing up for him. Captain Mitchell and Sergeant Major Williams positioned themselves closer to David, creating a subtle but clear indication that they were prepared to protect him from any inappropriate actions by Colonel Hawthorne. Their body language sent a message to the colonel and to the assembled observers that they would not stand by passively if the senior officer attempted to follow through on his threats. The arrival of the Provost Marshal was announced by the sound of a military police vehicle approaching the area. The distinctive markings of the MP vehicle immediately drew attention from everyone present, and a murmur of conversation began to spread through the crowd as people realized that official law enforcement was now involved in the situation. Lieutenant Colonel James Bradford, the base Provost Marshal, stepped out of the vehicle and quickly assessed the scene before him. He could see the large crowd of observers, the obvious tension between the various participants, and the positioning of military personnel that suggested some kind of serious confrontation was taking place. Bradford approached the group with the measured pace of someone who was accustomed to dealing with complex and potentially volatile situations. His presence immediately commanded attention from everyone present, as his role as the base's senior law enforcement officer gave him significant authority to investigate and resolve disputes involving potential criminal behavior. "Major Rodriguez," Bradford addressed the legal officer who had called him. "What's the situation here?" Rodriguez provided a brief but comprehensive summary of the confrontation, explaining Colonel Hawthorne's demand that David Chin salute him, the regulatory clarifications that had been provided, and the colonel's subsequent threat to have David arrested despite the fact that his demand was not legally justified. Lieutenant Colonel Bradford listened carefully to the briefing while observing the various participants in the confrontation. He could see the anger and frustration in Colonel Hawthorne's demeanor, the calm professionalism of Captain Mitchell and Sergeant Major Williams, and the respectful but determined stance maintained by David Chun. "Mr. Chun," Bradford addressed David directly, "I understand you're here for your brother's graduation ceremony. Has anyone explained to you what your rights and obligations are as a civilian visitor to this installation?" The question was significant because it established David's status as a legitimate visitor with specific rights, rather than treating him as a potential troublemaker or security threat. Bradford's professional approach immediately contrasted with Colonel Hawthorne's hostile and aggressive behavior. "Yes, sir," David replied respectfully. "Captain Mitchell and Major Rodriguez have both explained that as a civilian, I'm not required to perform military customs like saluting, although I should be respectful and courteous, which I've tried to be throughout this interaction." Bradford nodded and turned his attention to Colonel Hawthorne. "Colonel, I understand there's been some disagreement about the appropriate protocol in this situation. Can you explain your position? The question gave Colonel Hawthorne an opportunity to present his side of the story, but it also put him in the position of having to justify his actions to another senior officer who had the authority to investigate potential misconduct. The provost marshal's neutral but professional tone made it clear that he was treating this as a serious matter requiring careful investigation. Colonel Hawthorne's response revealed the extent to which he had become invested in his untenable position. Lieutenant Colonel Bradford, this civilian has shown flagrant disrespect for military authority by refusing to follow a direct order from a superior officer. I ordered him to salute, and he has refused to comply. This kind of behavior cannot be tolerated on a military installation. Bradford listened to the colonel's explanation while mentally noting the flaws in his reasoning. The provost marshal was well-versed in military regulations and civilian rights, and he immediately recognized that Colonel Hawthorne's position was not legally supportable. Colonel, Bradford replied carefully, I understand your concern about respect for military authority. However, I'm sure you're aware that civilian visitors are not subject to military orders in the same way that military personnel are. Army regulations are quite clear about the distinction between military customs that apply to personnel and the expectations for civilian visitors. The provost marshal's response was diplomatic but firm, providing Colonel Hawthorne with an opportunity to reconsider his position while also making it clear that his interpretation of the applicable regulations was incorrect. Bradford was essentially giving the colonel a chance to back down gracefully before the situation required more formal intervention. Lieutenant Colonel Bradford's diplomatic attempt to provide Colonel Hawthorne with an opportunity to gracefully withdraw from his untenable position represented a final chance for the senior officer to salvage what remained of his professional reputation. However, the colonel's pride and his inability to accept that he had been wrong about a fundamental military regulation drove him to make a decision that would have devastating consequences for his career and his legacy. I don't care about technicalities or regulatory interpretations, Colonel Hawthorne declared defiantly, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. I am a colonel in the United States Army, and when I give an order, it will be followed. I don't need permission from lawyers or MPs to enforce proper respect for military authority. The colonel's statement represented a complete rejection of the military system of laws and regulations in favor of personal authority based solely on rank. His words demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how military authority was supposed to work and revealed an attitude that was incompatible with professional military service. Lieutenant Colonel Bradford's expression grew serious as he processed the implications of what Colonel Hawthorne had just said. The senior officer had essentially declared his intention to ignore established military regulations and use his position to compel compliance with personal demands that had no legal basis. This was not merely a case of regulatory confusion. It was a clear abuse of authority that required immediate intervention. Colonel Hawthorne, Bradford said firmly, his tone shifting from diplomatic to official, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while I complete my investigation of this incident. Based on what I've observed and the statements that have been made, there are serious questions about the appropriateness of your actions that need to be addressed through proper channels. The provost marshal's words sent shock waves through the assembled crowd. Everyone present understood that a senior law enforcement officer had just essentially relieved a colonel of his authority in the situation and indicated that the colonel's behavior was being treated as potential misconduct requiring formal investigation. Colonel Hawthorne's reaction was one of complete disbelief and rage. He had never imagined that his authority could be questioned or that his actions could be subject to investigation by military police. The public nature of his humiliation made the situation even more devastating for his pride and his sense of professional identity. This is outrageous, Hawthorne shouted, his voice becoming increasingly shrill. You have no authority to interfere with my handling of a disciplinary matter. I demand to speak with the base commander immediately. Bradford maintained his professional composure despite the colonel's increasingly erratic behavior. Sir, the base commander will indeed be briefed on this situation. In the meantime, I'm asking you to step back and allow me to complete my investigation without further interference. The provost marshal's calm authority provided a stark contrast to Colonel Hawthorne's emotional outburst and helped to reassure the assembled observers that the situation was being handled by someone who understood both military regulations and proper procedures for addressing misconduct. David Chun watched these developments with a mixture of relief and amazement. What had begun as a simple refusal to perform a military salute that didn't apply to him had escalated into a major incident involving multiple senior officers and the base's law enforcement apparatus. He felt grateful for the support he had received from Captain Mitchell, Sergeant Major Williams, Major Rodriguez, and now Lieutenant Colonel Bradford, but he was also concerned about the broader implications of the situation. Captain Mitchell approached Lieutenant Colonel Bradford and requested permission to speak privately. The Provost Marshal nodded and stepped aside with the captain, creating an opportunity for a brief consultation away from the main group. "Sir," Mitchell said quietly, "I want to make sure you're aware that Mr. Chun has been completely respectful and appropriate throughout this entire incident. His only action was to politely decline to salute when ordered to do so by Colonel Hawthorne, and he's maintained a courteous demeanor despite considerable pressure and threats." Bradford nodded approvingly. "I've observed that myself, Captain. Mr. Chin's behavior has been exemplary, and his position regarding the saluting requirement is entirely correct according to applicable regulations. I'm more concerned about Colonel Hawthorne's escalating behavior and his apparent willingness to ignore established military law." The brief consultation between the two officers was observed by many in the crowd, who could see that they were discussing the situation seriously but couldn't hear the specifics of their conversation. The professional interaction between Captain Mitchell and Lieutenant Colonel Bradford helped to reinforce the sense that the situation was being handled appropriately by competent military leaders. Meanwhile, Sergeant Major Williams had positioned himself near David Chun, ready to provide assistance or protection if needed. The senior enlisted man's presence was reassuring to David and also served as a visible demonstration to the crowd that experienced military personnel supported the civilian's position and were prepared to ensure his safety. Major Rodriguez continued to monitor the situation while taking notes that would be used in any subsequent investigation or report about the incident. As the base's legal officer, she was responsible for documenting potential misconduct and ensuring that proper procedures were followed in addressing any violations of military law or regulations. The crowd of observers had grown even larger as word of the unusual confrontation spread throughout the immediate area of the base. Military personnel from various units had arrived to see what was happening, along with additional civilian visitors who had come for the graduation ceremony. Many were shocked by what they were witnessing, having never seen such a public breakdown of military professionalism by a senior officer. Among the newcomers was a group of military family members who had arrived early for the graduation ceremony. They watched the confrontation with particular interest because they could easily imagine themselves in David Chin's position, visiting the base to support their military relatives and finding themselves subjected to inappropriate demands or treatment. Lieutenant Colonel Bradford returned to the main group and addressed David directly. "Mr. Chun, I want to apologize on behalf of the installation for the inappropriate treatment you've received today. You have been completely within your rights throughout this incident, and you've conducted yourself with admirable restraint and respect despite considerable provocation." The Provost Marshal's public apology was significant because it represented an official acknowledgement by the military that David had been wronged and that the institution took responsibility for the inappropriate actions of its personnel. The apology also served to clearly establish that David had done nothing wrong and that his position had been entirely justified. "Thank you, sir," David replied gratefully. "I appreciate your understanding and the support I've received from several military personnel today. I hope this incident doesn't reflect poorly on my brother or interfere with his graduation ceremony." Bradford smiled reassuringly. "Mr. Chun, this incident reflects only on those who acted inappropriately. Your brother should be proud of the way you've handled this situation, and I can assure you that there will be no impact on his graduation or his military career. In fact, I'll make sure that Private Chin knows how impressed we are with his family's character and integrity." The Provost Marshal's reassurance about Tommy Chin's career was important because it addressed one of David's primary concerns throughout the confrontation. He had been worried that standing up for his principles might somehow have negative consequences for his brother's military service, and Bradford's statement helped to alleviate those fears. Colonel Hawthorne, who had been standing aside while Bradford spoke with David, made one final attempt to reassert his authority and salvage his position. "Lieutenant Colonel Bradford, I demand that you arrest this civilian for insubordination and trespassing. He has flagrantly violated military protocol and shown disrespect for a senior officer." Bradford turned to face Colonel Hawthorne with an expression that showed both disappointment and professional resolve. "Colonel, Mr. Chun has committed no crime and violated no regulations. His behavior has been entirely appropriate throughout this incident. I cannot and will not arrest someone for exercising their legal rights and conducting themselves in a respectful manner. The Provost Marshal's firm rejection of Colonel Hawthorne's demand represented the final nail in the coffin of the senior officer's position. It was now clear to everyone present that the colonel had been completely wrong about the applicable regulations and that his threats and demands had been inappropriate and unjustified from the beginning. What happened next would become the most talked-about moment in the entire confrontation. As Colonel Hawthorne realized that his authority had been completely undermined and that his position was indefensible, he made a desperate attempt to reassert control over the situation by physically reaching toward David Chun, apparently intending to force him into a saluting position. However, before the colonel could make contact, Captain Mitchell stepped smoothly between the two men, gently but firmly blocking Hawthorne's approach. "Sir, I respectfully suggest that would not be appropriate," Mitchell said calmly but with unmistakable authority. The intervention was swift and professional, preventing what could have been an assault while still maintaining proper respect for the colonel's rank. Captain Mitchell's action demonstrated the kind of leadership and moral courage that the military claimed to value, showing that sometimes doing what was right required standing up to authority when that authority was being misused. Lieutenant Colonel Bradford immediately stepped forward to address the escalating situation. "Colonel Hawthorne, I'm directing you to report to my office immediately for a formal interview regarding this incident. Any further inappropriate contact with Mr. Chun or interference with my investigation will result in additional charges being filed." The Provost Marshal's directive was essentially an arrest in all but name, removing Colonel Hawthorne from the scene and placing him under official investigation for his conduct. The public nature of this action sent a clear message to everyone present that the military was prepared to hold its own personnel accountable when they violated regulations or abused their authority. As Colonel Hawthorne was escorted away by military police personnel, the crowd of observers began to disperse, many of them discussing what they had witnessed in hushed but animated conversations. The incident would be talked about throughout Fort Henderson and beyond for years to come, serving as a powerful reminder that military authority had limits and that those who abused their positions would be held accountable. David Chun stood quietly for a moment, still processing everything that had happened. What should have been a simple visit to attend his brother's graduation had turned into a dramatic confrontation that involved multiple senior officers and the base's law enforcement apparatus. He felt grateful for the support he had received, but also somewhat overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had transpired. Captain Mitchell approached David with a warm smile. "Mr. Chun, I want you to know how impressed I am with the way you handled this situation. You stood up for your principles while maintaining respect and dignity throughout. That takes real courage." Sergeant Major Williams nodded in agreement. "Sir, you've shown the kind of character and integrity that we hope to see from all members of our military family, whether they wear the uniform or not. Your brother should be very proud." Major Rodriguez added her own perspective as the legal officer who had witnessed the entire confrontation. "Mr. Chun, your understanding of your rights and your willingness to stand up for them, while still showing respect for military personnel and the institution, was exemplary. You've helped ensure that military regulations are properly followed and that civilian rights are respected." Lieutenant Colonel Bradford concluded the informal debriefing by addressing the broader implications of what had occurred. This incident serves as an important reminder that military authority must always be exercised within the bounds of law and regulation. We are grateful to the personnel who spoke up when they witnessed inappropriate conduct, and we are committed to ensuring that all visitors to our installation are treated with the respect and courtesy they deserve. As the immediate crowd dispersed and normal base operations resumed, David Chun finally made his way toward the building where his brother's graduation ceremony would take place. He carried with him not only the satisfaction of having stood up for his principles, but also a deeper appreciation for the military personnel who had demonstrated true leadership by supporting what was right rather than simply deferring to authority. The graduation ceremony itself proceeded without incident, and Private Tommy Chun received his certificate and recognition for completing advanced training. When David finally had the opportunity to speak with his brother after the ceremony, he briefly explained what had happened at the main gate. Tommy's response was immediate and heartfelt. He was proud of his older brother for standing up for what was right, and he was grateful to serve in an institution where other personnel had demonstrated the integrity to support civilian rights and hold their colleagues accountable for misconduct. In the weeks and months that followed, the incident at Fort Henderson became a case study in military ethics and leadership courses throughout the armed forces. Colonel Hawthorne faced formal disciplinary action and was eventually removed from his position, while the personnel who had intervened to protect civilian rights and uphold military regulations were recognized for their professionalism and moral courage. The story of David Chin's refusal to salute and the subsequent confrontation served as a powerful reminder that true military leadership sometimes requires standing up to authority when that authority is being misused. It demonstrated that the military's stated values of integrity, honor, and respect for the law were more than just words. They were principles that required active defense when challenged. Most importantly, the incident showed that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most profound acts of bravery occur not on distant battlefields, but in everyday situations where individuals must choose between the easy path of compliance and the difficult path of standing up for what is right. David Chin's quiet determination to maintain his principles in the face of intimidation and threats prove that true strength lies not in the exercise of power over others, but in the moral courage to do what is right regardless of the personal cost.